Hey everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here with a book review for The Forever War by Joe Haldeman. This is a science fiction classic published in the early 70s about a man who is conscripted to join a space war. Essentially, in the 90s, Earth has discovered space exploration, and in this space exploration, there's a race of aliens that they are now in a war against. The main character, William Mandela, is drafted, and even though he doesn't want to join a war, he wants to stay on Earth and study physics and become a professor. He joins an elite military unit and essentially spends the next 1,000 years fighting this mysterious alien race. I gave this book 2 stars. I'm gonna say that right now. I'm not a fan of this book. I had a lot of thoughts and feelings, most of which I will be discussing in this review of unknown length at this point. It basically depends on how tired I get and how sore my throat is from talking, which may be 10 minutes and maybe like half an hour if I really get going. But suffice to say, not a fan. If you don't want to watch this video or the whole thing, basically the TLDR is I thought the writing style was crap, and I thought it was really sexist and homophobic, and just an overall shallow book. General thoughts. Let's get into some more specifics. First of all, the main character, William Mandela. He's a self-insert. There's really no way to get around him being a self-insert. He studied physics in college when he was drafted into the military, just like Joe Haldeman did. He studied physics in college before he was drafted into the Vietnam War, which he didn't want to join. Second, the love interest in this book is named Mary Gay. Joe Haldeman's long-term partner is also named Gay. Third, there are the names. Mandela, a little bit similar to Haldeman if you just sit there and look at the letters for a minute. Just in general, it seemed like this book was part fantasy, part therapy for him to deal with his time in Vietnam. Because this book is, at the end of the day, a Vietnam allegory, which I'll get into a little bit later, because I do want to discuss that. The main character of William Mandela, not an interesting guy, didn't have a whole lot of personality to him. I genuinely cannot sit here and describe to you what he was like. I can tell you the things that he did, some of the things that he said, but personality-wise, character-wise, there really wasn't anything there. I genuinely don't know what this man was like, despite following him for a whole book. It covered, his military training, and there was a brief period after he was in the military for a few years where he went back to Earth, and Earth had changed, and he was dealing with, family situations and this burgeoning romance, and, at that point, I almost wanted to give the book a chance. But then it just went back to the war, and he went back to having no thoughts, no personality on anything. He was just kind of there to parrot Joe Haldeman's opinions on war, I think, was basically his role in this book. None of the other characters basically existed in this book except for his love interest, Mary Gay, who, again, had very little personality. I can tell you things about her background, her parents, her stature in the war, but I genuinely can't tell you anything about her as a person. They fell in love, I guess. I think they were in love. They had a romantic relationship, but to be honest, I'm not sure how much of that was love and how much of it was just convenience, because there was a time dilation issue. So, 1,000 years had passed on Earth, and because they were both from the same time period, I don't know how much of it was just them connecting because that was all they had. But apart from those 2 characters, I can't tell you the name or a description of literally anyone else in this book. They basically didn't exist. So many people died, and I've never before sat while reading a book and just they would be like, oh yeah, Friedman died, and I'm like, did I know Friedman? Am I supposed to have feelings about his death or her death? To be honest, couldn't tell you. I was like, I genuinely don't know if this is a sad thing or not, if I'm supposed to be experiencing sadness, because I didn't feel anything at any of the deaths in this book, and there were a whole lot of deaths. This is a war book, lots of death going on. None of the characters were anything. They had zero personality, which sometimes you don't need characters with strong personalities to carry the book if you have a strong plot, but this book needed something, and the characters weren't doing it. So let's continue on. The writing style, because that was the second thing that I really just like can't get past. I don't read a whole lot of sci-fi. A lot of the reason for that is because I struggle with like sciencey things. Like heavy sciencey things don't make sense in my brain. Like I just cannot wrap my mind around scientific concepts at all. Like even very basic ones, I just can't do it. So that's one of the reasons I tend to not gravitate towards science fiction a lot, because it is a struggle for me. And it's kind of the same with military stuff. The military stuff just bores me. And so much of this book was just the military and sci-fi stuff. Like I was here for the story and the characters, and instead I got all the specs on their laser guns and how many G's they were traveling through space and the various military formations. And so much of that none of it, well, I'm not going to say none of it, very little of it contributed to the story. Like so much of it could have just been like left out. And I'm not saying it should have been. I'm just saying it could have been left out without damaging the narration. And I struggle with that a lot. This is something that if you like that kind of thing, you will definitely not struggle with that like I did. But it did seem like that was kind of the focus of the book, was, you know, the different guns and just like all the space travel stuff and all like the science that they tried to explain that like it was very pseudoscience anyway, but like just went over my head so much that I kind of wanted to skim. And it was just like there was all of that and sort of no story to go along with it, is how it felt to me. Like there was this war going on, but the focus was definitely on the military stuff. Like it went into so much depth on their military training for what felt like very little reason to me. It didn't feel like that was accomplishing anything in the story, except that he wanted to write about war. So he focused on the war, and the thematic elements, the characters, the narration, all kind of got left behind there. I really wanted a lot more emotion and philosophy, because I've definitely read war-based science fiction books that had, you know, kind of that depth of character and that emotion and that made you feel things while also focusing on the war itself. And I think the easy comparison here, for obvious reasons, is Old Man's War by Joan Scalzi. They've been compared a lot. Even in this book, they were compared. This came first, but I read Old Man's War and I really enjoyed that. I connected with the characters really well, and there was a lot of sci-fi and a lot of military stuff in that book, obviously, because it's a sci-fi military book, but there was also so much emotion and so much thought put into the narration and everything about it, that it wasn't just, that it wasn't just about the military and the sci-fi elements the way this book was. And it just felt like this book was so lacking in that regard. Like if you like reading about science fiction military stuff, sure, like it's got a lot of that, but it hasn't really got a whole lot else. Another thing that I struggled with so much was the time dilation. Interesting concept, don't get me wrong. I have enjoyed time dilation in other books and in shows and stuff, and I don't think the time dilation itself was poorly done, but I think the way it functioned in the story, because this takes place over thousands of years and the main character really only ages a couple of years, a lot of what's happening on Earth and in the war and in society are happening kind of in the background of this book, because the main character is skipping through time. Sometimes he'll be in travel for so long that by the time he pops out back to civilization, it's been 150 years. Everyone he knows is dead. I mean, not literally everyone, other people in the war are having the same issue, so like they're still them to some degree. But in large part, everything that's happening in society in the war on Earth is very background information, and he's missing so much of it, which means that you as the reader are also missing a lot of it. And it means when they need to catch you and him, the main character, up to speed, another character will come in and just explain everything that's happened, explain what's going on. And that happened more times than I can count in this book. I want to see things. I want to experience things. I want to feel things in a book. I don't want to be told by another character all the exciting things that have happened that I don't get to see. Like, for me, that defeats the purpose of writing a book. When the vast majority of the interesting action and the things that matter to the story are happening off screen, for me, that means the author's not doing his job. I just wound up missing so much of the development of what felt like the actual story that we just didn't get to see, that it almost felt like Joe Haldeman was trying to avoid writing an actual story. It felt like he was writing this for the military, for his own moral philosophy, for the allegory of Vietnam. And then the actual story was kind of getting in the way, so he kind of relegated that to like off-page stuff that would be summarized later, and I really, really hated that. That, for me, was the weakest aspect of this book. Like, you can save a lot of things with a decent story. If the story itself is compelling, I'm not going to love it without great characters, without great writing, without great meaning, but I can get past that if the story itself is compelling and draws me in. And this was just like, the story was all relegated to off-page. And I didn't understand the purpose of that. I've never read a book that did that and did that well. For me, that is always going to weaken a book significantly. And for here, it's like, once I realized like halfway through that that was going to be the bulk of the book, I kind of checked out mentally because it kept happening continuously a lot. It seemed like nothing was happening on the screen. He would just stop back in every few hundred years to just be like, oh, hey, I need a quick catch up. Cool, thanks. Bye again. There were things that would happen that they never even explained. Like, they would talk about how the dialect had changed, but it would be left at that, like, oh yeah, the dialect is a lot different now, so we had to make the new recruits learn old-timey English so they could talk to you. Which, like, okay, interesting concept. Let's delve into that, perhaps. Like, let's discuss that. How has the language changed? What's new? Literally never brought up. Literally never even tried to delve into that. It was just mentioned as like, oh yeah, this has changed. We're not going to talk about it though. And that felt like everything in this book, which I hated so, so much. And then we get to the Vietnam allegory. I like Vietnam allegories in books. This was definitely written in the early 70s based on the author's time in Vietnam. And I think it's an interesting plot for a sci-fi book like this. It's an interesting concept to discuss the war, like, metaphorically through this other means. But it was so shallow. Like, I have never read an allegory for Vietnam that was this absurdly shallow. It never actually discussed anything. It was just like, for a while, it literally felt like Vietnam with like sci-fi elements. They would just like draft these young people who didn't want to be there, who had other plans for their life, and then train them how to fight, send them off to war, and they didn't really understand what was going on. Lots of people were dying. They wanted to go home. They couldn't go home. And then you get to the end of the book that kind of like gives you that big like zinger, you know, of like the overall like meaning and theme of the book, which I don't want to discuss explicitly because of spoilers, but like you get there where they kind of explain the meaning, and it's like, done off the page. The characters are just given a book to read to explain everything, which again, my previous point, why would you do that? Why would you just avoid writing a story? Write the story. Give me the things that are happening as they're happening. Don't just have everything happen off the page. But more importantly, it was so shallow and so basic. It didn't get into any kind of depth. It was just like the most bare minimum you could do for a Vietnam allegory. Like, it contained no surprises. Like, I'm not going to discuss things explicitly because of spoilers, but I also can't imagine you're reading this book and will be surprised by the ending. It's not intended to be like a plot twist. It's just sort of similar to Vietnam and like similar discussions to Vietnam, but without actually discussing anything. It was just kind of slapped on to be like, oh yeah, these were my thoughts on Vietnam, so these are the same thoughts here. And so basic, so minimal. Like, it could have been a lot more interesting. They could have had a lot of discussion. Like, there is so much to discuss about Vietnam. And he just, like, despite writing an entire book that is a Vietnam allegory, he kind of avoided discussing anything at all. I just didn't understand the point, I guess, at that point. Like, you're writing this allegory, why not, like, actually discuss things in depth? And never once happened in this entire book. But okay, let's get into the weird stuff, because I wanted to discuss like the actual like book and what the book was doing first before I got into like the sexism and the homophobia. First thing with the sexism, when they were recruits, they were 50% men, 50% women. And every night they were assigned a bunkmate who they would sleep with in the same bed and generally have sex with. This was randomly assigned by like their leadership. They couldn't like opt out and sleep in their own bed. The men were assigned female partners every single night through training, and then there were, I guess, 50% beds for the, like, I think there were like 100, let's say 100. There were 100 people, 50 men, 50 women, and there were 50 beds. This happened throughout the entire book. I don't understand why. It was never discussed. At a point, I thought at the beginning that he was actually going to like discuss things, you know, like actually like this was going to have a purpose in the story because this is set in the future. I thought it was going to be like a societal commentary, like let's discuss something interesting here. No, never discussed. This is just the way things were, because I don't know, the only two reasons I could come up with were because this kind of felt very self-inserty. He wanted to like add a lot of sex to his fantasy so he could get laid. And the other thing I could think of was just that he wanted an easy way to add a bunch of gratuitous sex to this book. I don't really understand why. Like, it had no bearing on the plot. It was never discussed as like a societal commentary. It was just a thing that existed so he could like get laid every night, I guess. I was so confused. Like, the women were ostensibly treated as equals, but like blatantly never treated as equals. They were treated as like sex slaves for half of the book, it felt like. And then when women were promoted, the women were always promoted to like one level less than the men. Like, he'd be a commander and like his girlfriend would be a lieutenant or something. Like, the girls were always just like one level less, even when they were doing basically the same things and had the same experience. And it was just very obvious why, because it happened to multiple women in this book. But yeah, like the sharing of bed things was so weird. Like, I genuinely did not understand the inclusion of that, because it had nothing to do with anything. Like, it had no overall bearing on the plot or the story. It was just like there. And I don't know, I was so confused. Other people mentioned this line in reviews that women were required to have sex with the men. I'm saying other people said that in reviews. I don't remember that line. If it exists, I forget the exact line, but it was like women were required to bed any man who wanted them as of like the laws of a planet, which like rapey as all hell. But I don't remember that line. I might have just like buzzed past it, you know, like not every line stands out, even when it's something creepy. Like, you misread it, you skim it, whatever. I was kind of bored by this book, so like makes sense I would skip it unless they like took it out in later editions, because that is like, again, rapey as all hell. I don't have any other way to describe that, but I don't actually specifically remember that line, but I do remember at least 3 other Goodreads reviews discussing it. But yeah, like just really, really sexist. And then the homophobia thing was so weird. Like, also had literally nothing to do with the overall plot and narrative. It was just happening in the background. So basically on Earth, there was an overpopulation issue. Makes sense, happens a lot in sci-fi. And because of that, basically all the governments on Earth decided that the best and real only way to combat this issue was to have everyone be gay, which a couple of issues with that. Number one, does birth control not exist in your world? Strange, because the main character also commented on this. He was like, I had birth control. Like, we have birth control in the army because we're not allowed to like have children in the army. So like, you'd think they could have done that on Earth if it was that big of an issue, but apparently not. And B, everyone on Earth just turned gay eventually. Like, literally everyone. It took a couple of generations. It didn't happen all at once, but like by the time he visited Earth again, like 30 or 40 years later, there were a lot of gay people, like more than straight people, I think. Which, again, not really how that works, but okay. And then eventually it kept going to everyone on Earth was gay, and then being straight was criminalized. I would have a lot more to say on this if this were like a modern day book. But because this book is 50 years old, almost 50 years old, it's like, I don't know how it was intended, because that's a very homophobic subplot. Don't get me wrong. If this was today, I would be destroying this book. But it's like, I genuinely don't know if this was the author, like, trying to be progressive. Like, oh, hey, I can envision a world where a lot of people are gay, and like, oh, it got taken the wrong way for a little while, but it's still, like, okay to be gay. Like, I don't know if that was how he intended it, or if he was like, look at this slippery slope where, like, straight people aren't allowed, and like that's seen as psychopathy and so bad. Like, I don't know which way he was genuinely trying to intend it, because the main character is straight, but as he's seeing these worlds, like, he has a lot of internalized homophobia because of like how he grew up and the time period he grew up in. It was like very abnormal for him to see that, and like it wasn't normalized in his culture growing up. But you can see him throughout the book, like, making a genuine effort to become less homophobic and get used to it and like accept people, which, like, it was a weird juxtaposition to like see this very stereotypical like gay fear subplot, but also the main character like working hard to be okay with it and like doing like actual self-reflection on it, like, oh, like, I'm not okay with this, but like I do need to learn to be. I don't know, it was one of those weird, like, it made me very uncomfortable, but at the same time, I'm not sure how to take it. It was just this very strange subplot. And then at the end, it gave all the gay people a choice to become straight, and the only characters it followed up on took that choice and were very happy being straight. Again, problematic. I don't like using the word problematic, but like, y'all know what I mean here. It was just like a very strange subplot. Like, I couldn't get past it because it was just like, why does this exist when it has nothing to do with the story? And it was weird because in the Goodreads reviews I read about this, no one actually mentioned that. A lot of people mentioned the sexism of this, but no one discussed that, and I'm very confused and I don't actually know what my thoughts were on it. I was definitely not a fan of the gay subplot, but like, I didn't really understand it or what it was trying to do, so I'm not gonna be like, it was the worst thing. Like, it was pretty bad, don't get me wrong, but it was also like, I don't know if he was actually trying to be homophobic or if he was trying to be progressive. Like, in a 50-year-old book, it's hard to tell, but I do give it credit for the main character making an effort to be more accepting and to like relearn the way he saw the world in that respect. So I don't know. It was just very strange and had nothing to do with anything, but was at the same time like such a big part of the book. It was odd. I'll say that and I'll leave it here. It was just odd. So that was basically everything I have to say. Final thoughts, I didn't like it. I don't understand why it's considered a classic and why it's considered great. Like, it didn't offer a whole lot of anything. And I've definitely read other sci-fi that had like a similar amount of science and military aspects in it while still having great character development and like a great story. And this one just didn't. The story was kind of trash and the characters were nothing. And then you got to the overall like moral point in the Vietnam allegory, and it was just one of the most shallow things I've read. It's like the most shallow commentary on Vietnam I've ever read. And clearly Joe Haldeman has a lot of thoughts about Vietnam, considering he wrote a book about it, and he's written more than just this book about Vietnam. But it was weird to me that like it seemed like so much of his commentary got left out or like was just boiled down into almost nothing. I wasn't a fan. I don't think this was a very good book, and I don't really think I would recommend it to anyone. I don't know who the audience is for this, but according to the Goodreads reviews, a great many people love this book, so apparently there is a large audience for it, and I don't know if I'm missing the point, or if it's just like the guns and military stuff that people like, but it very much was not for me. I just don't understand what people get out of it, honestly. Like, I tried to read some of the reviews and, like, I don't know, none of them seemed to have anything really interesting to say or anything that I was like, oh yeah, I could see liking that part. It was just like, great science fiction classic. Love the military stuff or whatever. More in depth than that, but like, you know what I mean? I didn't like it. So if you have read this book, if you do enjoy it, I would love to have discussions in the comments with you because I am curious. I got so little out of it that I struggle to see what other people did, even after reading their reviews. I don't know. This is one of those books I'm just confused by. It's a sci-fi classic, but it just seems to offer so little in the greater scheme of things. I haven't read all that many sci-fi books, but I've read so many that were better than this one by a long shot. I'm going to wrap this up because this video is getting overly long. Thank you for watching my review on one of my least favorite books of the year. I had a lot to say. I had a lot of thoughts on this one. Wasn't originally planning to do a video, but I just kept thinking about it. So let me know down below what you thought of this book if you've read it. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.